Hey guys, tonight we slip into something starched and uncomfortable. You're stepping softly through the flickering gaslight of a Victorian drawing room where everything smells faintly of camphor, boiled cabbage, and social repression. Outside, the streets echo with the clop of carriage wheels and the cries of flower girls. Inside, the wallpaper is velvet. The doilies are elaborate, and the conversations painfully polite. No one dares mention ankles, much less, well, those things. Tonight's story is about medicine. Sort of. It's also about madness. Sort of. But mostly it's about one of the most absurdly serious periods in history, treating one of the most silliest conditions with one of the most unintentionally erotic solutions. Victorian doctors, upright, whiskered men of science, genuinely believed that female hysteria could be treated by inducing what they delicately called paroxysms. In other words, yeah. This is a tale of stiff collars, stiff upper lips, and mysteriously recurring doctor's appointments. You probably won't survive this with a straight face. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is over there. I love seeing how far and wide this sleepy little corner of the internet stretches. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You sit on the tufted edge of a chaise lounge, staring politely at a dusty globe in the corner. The doctor enters, not rushed, never rushed, and closes the door with an ominous clack. He's wearing pince-nez glasses and a look of mild irritation, as if your uterus personally offended him this morning. He opens his little black case. Inside, no pills, no thermometers, just oils, gloves, towels, and if you're one of his more elite patients, a brass machine that hums like a nervous bumblebee. Welcome to 19th century England, where doctors are in the business of touching nerves, and where female distress is categorized as a medical condition best solved by a brisk manual intervention. But don't worry, this is all very scientific. The concept of hysteria has been around since ancient Greece, but the Victorians gave it a proper corset and top hat. In their world, hysteria meant everything and nothing. A woman was too quiet? Hysteria. Too loud? Also hysteria. Interested in sex? Definitely hysteria. Not interested in sex? Especially hysteria. Historians still argue whether this was a genuine medical confusion or a wildly convenient way to police women's emotions, desires, and social roles. Take poor Mrs. Wilhelmina Fortescue Larby, an invented name for an all-too-real archetype, a respectable woman of means, plagued by nervous agitation, bouts of weeping, and occasional urges to run outside without a parasol. Her physician prescribes weekly massage sessions. These aren't full body, mind you, just one very specific region, carried out with utmost delicacy and zero eye contact. Many of these women didn't even realize what was happening, just that they left the clinic flushed, dazed, and mysteriously better. Now imagine being the poor doctor. As described by historian Rachel Maines, these gentlemen spent hours each day, manually working their way through a lineup of patients, hands cramping, wrists aching. Entire careers built on bringing Victorian women to the brink of something they weren't even allowed to name. Sex with Kings, a cheeky but deeply researched book by Eleanor Herman, notes how sex and power often tangled behind royal curtains. And while this isn't quite Versailles-level scandal, the Victorian doctor's office had its own kind of secret intimacy, one wrapped in lace, propriety, and the powerful denial of what was plainly going on. You might think someone would eventually say, wait, is this sexual? But no, because if it's done by a doctor, in a waistcoat under flickering gaslight, in a room that smells like eucalyptus, it's medicine, darling. One fringe tidbit here. Some women brought knitting to their appointments. That's right, knitting. While the doctor did his thing, they'd sit upright, crocheting antimacassars, occasionally sighing. Imagine a patient humming "God Save the Queen" while receiving pelvic massage therapy. That's the level of denial we're dealing with. There were, of course, doubters. Even within the profession, a few eyebrow raises, though never too high, lest they wrinkle one's scholarly forehead. Some male physicians privately confessed to feeling awkward or even unwell after a long day of treatment. And so, the need for innovation arrived, not out of decency, but pure carpal tunnel syndrome. Hence, the vibrator. But more on that in a bit. Right now, you're reclining in the care of a profession that sees you not as a person with inner life and agency, but a fragile bouquet of nerves. And your doctor believes, firmly, sincerely, that he's doing you a favor. Not intimacy, not power, just science. It's easy to scoff from here, but step back into the soot-streaked streets of London and you'll realize this was normal. This was how things were. And in that sense, perhaps the weirdest thing about Victorian medicine is how utterly convinced it was of its own righteousness. You wake, or rather stir, still in the parlor of 19th century absurdity. Outside, the fog curls in like a nosy neighbor. Inside, the fireplace pops gently, its flickers illuminating shelves lined with books on phrenology, laudanum, and moral hygiene. Let's settle in and ask the most basic question of all: what even was hysteria? To modern ears, it sounds like an emotion, a mood swing, maybe an overreaction at a brunch table. But in the Victorian era, it was a full-blown medical diagnosis, complete with symptoms, treatments, and an entire cultural industry built around it. According to the physicians of the time, hysteria could include fatigue, insomnia, fluid retention, irritability, anxiety, depression, fainting spells, sexual desire, loss of sexual desire, sneezing at the wrong time, and one especially vague favorite, a general feeling of malaise. So, essentially, being a human person in a corset. But the diagnosis didn't apply to all humans. Oh no, just women. Exclusively women. And therein lies the real hysteria. Doctors believed hysteria arose from the womb. Literally. They imagined the uterus as a mischievous creature that could move around the body like a misbehaving pet. If you were feeling breathless, that was your womb drifting too close to the lungs. Random leg numbness? Probably your uterus doing cartwheels. The root of the word itself comes from the Greek hystera, meaning uterus. So hysteria was, quite literally, the disease of the wombed. Historians still argue whether the men of medicine truly believed in this roving organ, or if it was just an elegant excuse to keep women under observation. Either way, they clung to the idea with alarming enthusiasm. There's even a scene in Peter Webb's The Erotic Spirit Through History that describes how physicians in the Middle Ages attempted to lure the uterus back into place with pleasant scents, or drive it out, of problematic areas with unpleasant ones. A medieval scratch and sniff solution, if you will. Fast forward to the Victorians, and those same gendered assumptions persist, but now with more waistcoats. Doctors of the era often claimed that the uterus, when left idle for too long, would become temperamental. A woman who hadn't married? Dangerous. A woman who'd married but didn't have children yet? Highly suspect. The cure was sometimes sex, but since most of these women weren't supposed to be desiring sex in the first place, physicians began looking for workarounds. Cue the gloved hand. Physicians began performing what they called pelvic massages, a deeply clinical term that made the whole experience sound like a stiff breeze in a linen closet. In practice, it involved manually stimulating the patient until she reached a paroxysm, a term that allowed doctors to avoid saying orgasm while still billing for it. And this wasn't considered salacious. It was a standard office visit, like getting your ears checked or your teeth cleaned, except everyone left a bit flustered and no one made eye contact. There's a quiet brilliance to the euphemisms used. One medical pamphlet of the era referred to hysteria as a condition caused by congestion of reproductive organs. The solution? Evacuation of said congestion by induced rhythmic activity. Translation: we're going to solve your feelings with vibrations, but gently, respectfully. And definitely not because we think you need to feel pleasure. Oh no, pleasure is for French people. One of the most famous anecdotes comes from Sex with Kings by Eleanor Herman, in which she describes how some royal mistresses would fake illness just to summon their physician lovers. While that was more about power play than actual medical confusion, it illustrates how intertwined medicine and sexuality have always been, especially when the person in charge gets to decide which is which. Back in the middle-class world, Mrs. Emily Templeton Brown, again, a totally invented name but spiritually accurate, has been diagnosed with low spirits and womb malaise. Her husband, a quiet man who smells like mothballs and empire, has sent her to the doctor 3 times this week. She's knitting faster now. Something about the appointments seems to be helping. But is it healing? Or hush? Here's the fringe tidbit of this chapter. Doctors at the time published actual treatment logs. One described a patient who achieved a paroxysm in 15 minutes on average, though up to 30 when mood or marital stress interfered. Imagine writing that in your medical journal and thinking, yes, this is science. And remember, this was all taking place while Queen Victoria sat on the throne. An image of maternal virtue, deeply domestic, and definitely not amused by anything remotely naughty. So society maintained a very careful dance. Pretend the treatment wasn't sexual, pretend the illness wasn't imagined, and absolutely pretend everyone involved was just exhausted. Even today, the lines around hysteria blur. Was it a misdiagnosis? A misinterpretation of depression, anxiety, trauma, and unspoken desires? Or was it something darker? An invented ailment designed to pathologize female independence? Historians still debate it. What's clear, though, is that the Victorian world struggled with the idea of a woman having autonomy over her life, her time, or her body. Hysteria was the diagnosis, but the disease? It might have been society itself. So you sit here warm beside the fire, wondering how many women smiled politely through their treatments, grateful for a moment that felt like something but could never be named. You're still in that faintly perfumed sitting room where the wallpaper curls like it's trying to listen in, and the doilies have seen more whispered breakdowns than a modern HR office. The doctor's chair creaks ever so gently. You've adjusted your skirts exactly 3 times, and your gloved hands are now politely clasped. There's tea. There's tension. And beneath it all, the ever-present hum of Victorian absurdity. So let's finally ask the unspoken question everyone seems to be politely ignoring beneath layers of lace and laudanum. Why women? Why is it always women who are fainting, swooning, being diagnosed, massaged, and gently institutionalized for the crime of being slightly unhappy? Why isn't Mr. Wilkins down the road, who spends half his days shouting at pigeons and the other half hiding in the pantry, getting a dose of pelvic massage? Because the entire diagnosis of hysteria was never about health. It was about femininity, specifically the Victorian fear of what femininity might look like if left unchecked. Hysteria became the elegant pseudo-medical explanation for almost any behavior in women that didn't quite align with what was considered proper. If you were too weepy, hysteria. Too cheerful, suspicious hysteria. Interested in science? That's textbook hysteria, dear. Preferred solitude over sewing circles? Alarming. Questioned your husband's investment in salt mines? Dangerous. In short, anything outside a narrow band of behavior painted you as a case for concern, and ideally, for treatment. The prevailing theory was simple. Women were biologically inferior, emotionally unstable, and spiritually porous. Their wombs, yes, wombs again, were considered temperamental beasts, capable of straying from their designated anatomical corners. This wandering womb theory, inherited from ancient medical texts, had evolved into a Victorian mantra. When women misbehaved, their insides must be blamed. And if the uterus was the root of all this unruliness, then naturally, doctors believed it must be calmed. Historians still argue whether the physicians of this era genuinely believed in these womb-related superstitions, or whether it was a cultural smokescreen for controlling women. The truth is likely both. Part sincere confusion, part systemic power move. What's undeniable is that women's bodies were pathologized for just existing. Peter Webb, in The Erotic Spirit Through History, explores how eroticism was reframed by religion and medicine into a space of anxiety, particularly for women. The Victorians absorbed this anxiety and doubled down, turning female desire into a medical disorder and female indifference into one too. In a stunning act of illogic, women were declared both too sensual and too frigid at the same time, depending on the needs of the diagnosis. Let's meet someone who represents this archetype. Lady Imogen Fairchild Davies, fictional but spiritually accurate. A woman of high birth and liberal education, she is fond of poetry and has been known to quote Sappho without irony. She once tried to found a ladies' reading club that included a copy of The Origin of Species. And the result? Her husband calls the doctor to report signs of hysteria. Symptoms include reading after supper, questioning the necessity of petticoats, and sighing at the piano in an unladylike key. The doctor listens gravely. He jots down notes like emotional instability and uterine heaviness, and then he prescribes the standard treatment, pelvic massage, once weekly. The lady finds herself oddly restored, but she must never speak of why. this wasn't uncommon. Women across Europe and North America were diagnosed with hysteria for reasons that now sound laughable, even absurd. One American medical text from the 1850s listed inappropriate literary ambition as a potential trigger for hysteria. Another cited spiritual confusion due to Protestant reading habits. And still, somehow men were never diagnosed. A man could suffer from melancholia. He could be afflicted by the pressures of finance or the burdens of empire. But the solution for his condition was typically a change of scenery, a glass of brandy, or a trip to Switzerland. No one ever suggested he needed to be touched in the name of science. Women, though, they got the glove. Some historians have unearthed case notes from physicians that are so dry, they loop back around to unintentionally hilarious. One entry: patient reached paroxysm after 18 minutes of massage, showing signs of recovery. Her husband remains skeptical of results. Another notes, repeated episodes of melancholy appear relieved by pelvic intervention. Prognosis, encouraging. Expense, high. And here's a delicious fringe detail. Some women began exaggerating their symptoms to escape housework. One diarist noted a suspicious increase in monthly agitation among upper-middle-class women, especially between 3 and 6 p.m., conveniently when supper preparation loomed. The doctor, of course, came at once. But what's more interesting than individual cases is the institutional logic behind it all. Victorian medicine wasn't just reacting to women's emotions. It was producing them. The very structure of diagnosis and treatment ensured that women remained dependents, never agents. Michel Foucault, in The History of Sexuality, discusses how power doesn't just repress desire, it shapes it, names it, and makes it legible to authority. In Victorian clinics, women were taught to interpret their own discomfort as illness, and their illness as something that only the male medical gaze could resolve. They weren't patients, they were puzzles. Problems to be solved with latex fingers and vaguely humming instruments. So here you are, reclining in a sitting room that smells faintly of violet soap and warmed leather. The fireplace is now just soft embers. Outside, a carriage rolls past, and inside, a doctor with the stiffest of collars gently reminds you that your tears, your longings, and even your dreams have all been categorized. Alphabetized. Treated. Not because you are broken, but because you are inconvenient. You shift slightly in your seat, a brocade settee that feels more like a well-dressed punishment than anything approaching comfort. The gas lamp overhead gives a tiny hiss, like it's also suppressing an opinion. And now, it's time to follow the hysteria trail a little further back in time, to where the whole mess began, the wandering womb. Picture this: ancient Greece, olive groves, philosophers in long robes, wandering around barefoot, arguing about metaphysics and female anatomy, often simultaneously. And one of their more enduring ideas? That a woman's womb could literally drift around her body like a confused jellyfish, causing chaos wherever it went. You feel a tightness in your chest? Probably your uterus pressing on your lungs. You've lost your appetite? Uterus, again, hovering rudely near your stomach. Sudden blindness? That darn uterus is probably up behind your eyeballs, taking a scenic tour of the cranium. It would be hilarious if it hadn't stuck around for, 2,000 years. This wandering womb theory, most famously described by Hippocrates and later by Galen, became a foundational pillar of Western medical thought. The uterus, they said, was dry and hungry and had a tendency to roam if not kept satisfied by regular marital activity. Left unfed by pregnancy or intercourse, it would sulk, meander, and wreak havoc. One ancient Greek prescription was to wave pleasant perfumes near the nose and foul ones near the lady bits, attempting to lure the womb back into its rightful position. It's womb fishing, essentially, with scented bait. Historians still argue whether this bizarre theory was sincerely believed, or just a very convenient explanation for behaviors that society didn't know what to do with. But either way, it was carried forward, through the Roman Empire, into medieval medicine, and straight into the Victorian consulting room with barely a raised eyebrow. Fast forward to the 1800s, and that same uterus has now been renamed the seat of feminine instability. Doctors began linking the organ to nerves, and nerves to morality, and morality, of course, to social obedience. So when a woman refused to marry, it wasn't personal preference, it was a failure of her reproductive system. Probably the uterus was sulking again. Now, Let's meet a woman whose entire life was shaped by this theory. Real or imagined, we'll never know. Her name was Mary Mole Fitzgibbon, a moderately well-documented Irish woman whose case appeared in several mid-19th century London medical journals. Mole was a maid in a noble house who began experiencing what was described as tremors, sleeplessness, and a fixed gaze into nothingness. She was given the hysteria diagnosis immediately. The prescribed treatment? Aside from the usual warm baths and rest, she was told to marry quickly. When she refused, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of stubbornness, she was admitted to a private women's sanatorium in Surrey. There, she received weekly uterine alignment therapy, which involved lying on an incline board and being massaged until the physician deemed her womb appeased. The notes don't say whether it worked, but they do note she stopped making eye contact after the second week. Historians today still debate whether her case reflected genuine neurological distress or a life boxed in by impossible expectations. Meanwhile, the idea that the womb had a personality, grumpy, petulant, faintly manipulative, became something of a cultural trope. It shows up in novels, sermons, even political pamphlets. One doctor writing in 1852 said that a woman's body was a house ruled by the uterus, whose moods dictate the household. That metaphor says more about Victorian domestic power dynamics than it does about biology. Fringe detail? Some Victorian healers tried to invent devices to track the womb's position. One such contraption, described in a now lost patent application, was essentially a leather corset with a compass embedded at the stomach, based on the logic that if the womb moved, the compass would misalign. As far as we know, it never worked. But it did produce some wildly awkward dinner parties. And then there were the medical maps of the uterus, printed in anatomical texts, complete with tiny illustrations showing where the organ might travel during a hysterical episode. Imagine a subway map, but inside your body, and much less reliable. Why was this idea so persistent? Because it offered a simple solution to a complex truth. Women felt things, deep, real, destabilizing things. And in an age where female emotion was treated as a fault line in the foundation of civilization, it was more comfortable to believe those feelings came from a rogue organ than from a legitimate inner life. You start to see the pattern, don't you? When society can't explain something, especially if it's inconvenient, it often assigns it a name. When it still doesn't understand it, it gives it a diagnosis. And if it wants to control it, it prescribes a cure. So here you sit, not in ancient Greece, but in a world that still echoes with its theories. The doctor at your side might wear a cravat instead of a toga, but his diagnosis is strikingly similar. Your feelings are not your own. Your longings are anatomical. Your moods? Merely the wanderings of a cranky organ in need of redirection. And what's the treatment? Well, he'll get to that, eventually. You're reclining now, figuratively, emotionally, on the plush, fainting couch of historical absurdity. The gaslight flickers, the tea has gone tepid, and your corset, if you were wearing one, would be protesting like a tired tuba in a marching band. Time to meet the unsung heroes and victims of the great pelvic massage craze. Now, if the term pelvic massage makes you blink a few times, you're not alone. Even the doctors of the Victorian era knew this phrase was doing a lot of heavy lifting, but they clung to it like it was the last respectable fig leaf between science and scandal. Let's walk through the process. A woman would arrive at her physician's office, usually with a note from her husband, a companion in tow, and a subtle air of practiced denial. She'd be led behind a velvet curtain or into a side room, always discreet, always professional. There, the doctor would apply oil, make no eye contact, and begin what medical journals described as manual stimulation of the pelvic tissues to encourage release of congestion. This went on until the patient achieved what they called a paroxysm, a full-body shudder, a release, a not-quite-named sensation that, by all appearances, did the trick. And here's the kicker. They didn't call it an orgasm. That would have been improper. That would have turned medicine into something else. So instead, they called it therapeutic relief. Historians still argue whether the doctors genuinely didn't realize they were inducing orgasms or whether they did, but chose to categorize it as anything but sexual. Some argue that men of that era were so emotionally repressed, so steeped in gendered science, that they couldn't imagine pleasure happening in a medical context. Others think they knew exactly what was happening and just preferred to keep a respectable silence. In Sex with Kings, Eleanor Herman explores how royalty often blurred the line between healing and desire. But in the middle-class consulting room, the stakes were different. This wasn't about seduction. It was about control, regulation. The steady, gloved hand of society gently nudging women back into emotional compliance, once a week or as needed. Now, imagine being the doctor. Let's take the case of Dr. Lionel Thistlethwaite, fictional, but assembled from many real accounts. Dr. Thistlethwaite begins his medical career with dreams of treating fever, gout, and the occasional gentleman's liver complaint. Instead, he finds himself spending 8 hours a day massaging distressed housewives, while his nurse brings in fresh towels and tries not to giggle. After 3 years, he develops a repetitive strain injury. His diary notes a mixture of embarrassment and pride. He's relieved that Mrs. B's melancholy has lifted, but concerned about the condition of his own wrist tendons. That, my friends, is Victorian burnout. The treatment itself was so physically demanding that some doctors hated offering it, but felt professionally obligated to do so. It was the standard of care, after all. And if Mrs. Featherstone comes in every Friday at 2:30 sharp, well, who are you to say no? Let's talk numbers. Some physicians saw as many as 6 to 10 hysteria patients a day. Multiply that by the time and effort required, and suddenly manual stimulation starts to look less like medical heroism and more like a very awkward gym routine. Enter the fringe tidbit of the day: pelvic massage apprenticeships. Yes, in some clinics, younger doctors would be taught the proper technique by observing senior physicians. Sometimes using anatomical dummies, sometimes not. Imagine your first day on the job involving a polite tutorial on how to encourage uterine clarity. No pressure. And the patients? Many reported relief. Not in the emotional sob into a hanky way you might expect, but in the dazed, light-footed, slightly dreamy manner of someone whose body had been reset. One woman wrote in her private letters that her doctor was a magician of the nerves. Though she noted the experience was neither romantic nor unromantic, simply inevitable. A quote that, frankly, sums up the entire Victorian attitude toward sex. But here's where it gets even weirder. Doctors began competing for patients. Some had better technique, faster hands, softer gloves, and word spread quietly, discreetly among elite women's social circles. There were preferred practitioners and appointment wait lists. It became a thing, like booking a facial. But Victorian. And of course, there was etiquette involved. Women were expected to behave with supreme decorum during treatment. No sounds, no movements. If you gasped or squirmed, it was considered unseemly. A successful treatment was one that ended in silent relief and an immediate return to embroidery. Meanwhile, medical journals began publishing articles with titles like Notes on Pelvic Nerve Excitation and Female Hysteria, or On the Benefits of Repetitive Local Massage for Nervous Women. They described the treatment process in such clinical language that you could almost forget what they were really doing. Almost. This entire phenomenon lived in a bizarre space between denial and indulgence. It was sensual, but not acknowledged as such. It was therapeutic, but only because they couldn't say pleasurable. And it was widespread. This wasn't a fringe treatment. This was mainstream medicine. The ultimate irony? No one was truly allowed to enjoy it. The doctors were overworked, the women were misdiagnosed, and the real cause, repressed sexuality, loneliness, anxiety, systemic gender injustice, remained untouched. Because you see, once a woman's nerves had been soothed, no one needed to ask why she was unhappy in the first place. And you, dear listener, sit among them now. Your skirts fanned out just so, your hat tilted politely, your feelings filed under hysterical. All fixed, all better, for now. You're back in the doctor's office now, or maybe a private parlor if you're particularly well-to-do. Either way, the walls are tastefully papered, the air smells faintly of lemon balm and old furniture polish, and the humming is mechanical. Yes, the tired hands of the Victorian physician are about to get a break. Enter the electromechanical vibrator. It's not what you think. Or rather, it is, but not the way it's marketed. The earliest medical vibrators weren't sleek gadgets hidden in nightstands. No, these were hefty contraptions that looked more like industrial-age blenders than anything remotely discreet. The first widely recognized electromechanical vibrator, patented in the 1880s, was the brainchild of one very exhausted man, Dr. Joseph Mortimer Granville. More on him later. For now, imagine a machine roughly the size of a sewing machine with gears, belts, a hand crank, or electric motor if you were fancy, and a humming intensity that could shake the mahogany off your credenza. These machines were designed for speed and consistency. The logic was that since doctors were dealing with increasing numbers of hysteria patients, and, let's be honest, developing early-onset carpal tunnel, mechanization was the obvious next step. Some clinics used steam-powered models. Others had belt-driven tabletop devices. Some were portable, in the sense that they could technically be moved from one room to another if you had strong arms and no stairs. But all of them promised a more efficient and reliable delivery of the famed paroxysm. Historians still debate how patients perceived the experience. Some women, especially those of the upper classes, saw it as a cutting-edge medical indulgence. They'd heard whispers at the dressmakers or across the tea table. Dr. Edmonds uses the newest device. It has 2 attachments. Others may have felt confused, even alarmed, at the transition from gentle hands to buzzing brass. One woman, Lady Eugenia Broughton Smythe, fictional, but, again, very spiritually accurate, is said to have fainted upon seeing the device wheeled in, only to return weakly thereafter, claiming renewed emotional clarity. Whether she knew the full implications of the machine's power is uncertain. There's an extraordinary moment in Peter Webb's The Erotic Spirit Through History, where he describes the shift from human to mechanical touch in clinical settings as a de-eroticization masked in progress. Meaning, when a machine does it, it must be medicine. There's no intimacy, no risk of impropriety, just gears, oil, and pure efficiency. No sin. Just science. Let's return now to the inventor himself, Dr. Joseph Mortimer Granville. Poor Dr. Granville. A man of dry humor, upright moral stance, and zero intention of creating a pleasure device. He invented the first vibrator in 1883 purely to address muscle fatigue and neuralgia, aches, cramps, that sort of thing. His model, known as Granville's hammer, used a battery-powered motor to deliver consistent pulses. It was heavy, loud, and not at all designed for the dainty bits. And yet, within a few years, his invention had been eagerly co-opted by the medical community for hysteria treatments. Dr. Granville was furious. He wrote publicly that he never intended the device to be used in application to the female organs, and that such practice was entirely without my consent or participation. Historians still argue whether Granville's outrage was sincere prudery or a belated attempt to maintain professional distance from what his invention had become. Either way, the medical world shrugged and carried on buzzing. By the 1890s, ads for vibratory devices began appearing in women's magazines. And here's where the line between medicine and consumerism starts to blur. Some were marketed as therapeutic tools for nervous disorders. Others were pitched more vaguely as personal health massagers, often illustrated next to roses, angels, or women in impossibly blissful recline. A favorite fringe fact? The vibrator was one of the first 5 household devices to be electrified, right after the sewing machine, fan, toaster, and lamp. That's right. Before most people had a vacuum cleaner, they had this. There were hand-cranked models for travel, battery-powered ones for the home, and even spa-grade machines installed in beauty parlors for restoration therapy. Some looked like dental drills. Others resembled oversized fountain pens. All came with discreetly worded instructions and a knowing smile from the shop girl. But even as the machines spread, no one was really talking about what they were for. The taboo remained intact. This was still about health, balance, female nerves. Nothing as unseemly as pleasure. In The History of Sexuality, Foucault unpacks how institutions like medicine develop an entire vocabulary to name things without naming them. This was exactly that. The Victorian vibrator was surrounded by a linguistic fog, full of euphemisms like restorative stimulation, nervous relief, and gentle excitation of tissues. But the truth buzzed just beneath the surface. And the results? Well, they spoke for themselves. Women felt better, they slept, they smiled, their husbands noticed. But no one could quite say why. Some women even began requesting home models, citing convenience. One 1895 letter, found in the archives of a now-defunct London clinic, described a patient asking her physician whether she might rent a device for use during the week, as the travel into town is somewhat wearying. The doctor approved it, grudgingly. So here you sit, in a well-draped room, a modest machine whirring quietly beside you. The doctor nods solemnly. The nurse adjusts the curtains. You're not sure what's about to happen, but the other ladies in your circle seem calmer. More. Luminous, you trust the science. What could possibly go wrong? Now that the doctor's hands have been relieved by the marvels of mechanical hum, let's shift scenes. You're no longer in a plush consultation room or drawing parlor. Tonight, you're in a different kind of institution. A place where fresh air is carefully rationed, letters are censored, and the word recovery is whispered like a spell. Welcome to the Victorian Rest Cure Clinic. At first glance, these places resemble country manners. Ivy-covered walls, sweeping lawns, polite staff with forced smiles and clipboard precision. But the reality? They're more like genteel prisons for women whose only crime was having thoughts, feelings, or, heaven forbid, ambitions that rattled their husbands. These clinics catered almost exclusively to upper and middle-class women diagnosed with hysteria, nervous exhaustion, female melancholia, or moral fatigue. The treatment prescribed was the infamous rest cure, a protocol that included forced bed rest, isolation from family and books, no writing, no socializing, and a diet that would make a Victorian orphan blush. Imagine being told you need to lie still for 6 weeks. No reading, no journaling, no conversation, unless it's with your nurse. The windows are locked. The blinds are drawn. You're weighed daily, measured, watched. And if you try to resist, that's a sign your hysteria is deepening. One of the rest cure's most famous architects was Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell, an American physician whose methods were widely copied in England. His protocol insisted on a strict separation of the nervous woman from her household and intellectual life. She was to become, in his words, a child again, passive, obedient, and easy to manage. Historians still argue whether Mitchell's intentions were cruel or merely clueless. Was he trying to help women by removing them from overstimulation? Or was this a velvet-gloved way to enforce silence? One of his most famous patients, reluctantly, was Charlotte Perkins Gilman, a writer and early feminist thinker. Her experience at the hands of Mitchell's rest cure would later become the inspiration for her chilling short story, The Yellow Wallpaper, in which a woman, confined to a nursery-turned-sick room, begins to lose her grip on reality while staring at the walls. In her autobiography, Gilman wrote that the treatment nearly drove her mad. She begged to read, to write, to see friends. She was denied. When she finally fled the clinic, she vowed to warn others, and she did, with fiction sharper than any medical rebuttal. But not all women had Gilman's resolve or the social capital to resist. For many, the rest cure became a slow erasure. Women who entered the clinics with nerves came out ghostlier, their curiosity dulled, their fire smothered. Take the fictional but all too possible case of Eleanor Winthrop Baxley, a well-to-do woman who had started asking dangerous questions. Could she inherit property? Could she write a pamphlet about suffrage? Could she travel without a male chaperone? Her husband called a doctor. She was pale, irritable, and inclined toward activism. Diagnosis: hysteria. Treatment: 6 weeks at Rosehaven Clinic, a name that sounds soothing until you realize the only thing blooming there is silence. Fringe detail of the day: some clinics offered electrotherapy as part of the rest cure. Mild electric shocks administered to the spine or abdomen to stir the nerves. The rationale was that the body needed to be simultaneously subdued and jolted. A contradiction that neatly sums up Victorian medicine. Patients were often prescribed milk-heavy diets, quarts of it per day, along with raw eggs and meat broths. The idea was to rebuild feminine vitality. The result? Constipation, discomfort, and a general sense of being both full and profoundly empty. There were, of course, daily weigh-ins. A woman who failed to gain weight was considered resistant. One who gained too much was said to be overcompensating. The scale was always watching, and the scale never lied, except about everything that really mattered. But perhaps the most telling aspect of the rest cure was its central irony. It was billed as healing, but it removed every possible source of actual recovery. Human contact, purpose, autonomy, laughter, all stripped away, replaced with soft beds, bland food, and a steady drip of medical condescension. In The History of Sexuality, Foucault notes how medical institutions define health not as a return to life, but a return to order. The Rest Cure exemplified this perfectly. It wasn't about making women feel better, it was about making them behave better. There's something almost haunting about imagining these clinics at night. The long, carpeted hallways, the oil lamps casting flickering shadows, the rows of women lying still in narrow beds, forbidden to read the thoughts of others or record their own. Some cried quietly, some stared at the ceiling. Some counted cracks in the plaster until their days blurred together like soft fog rolling through the moors. And if one did resist, tried to run or screamed or tore up the curtains, they'd be moved to a quieter room. Further down the hall. Further from the garden, closer to the locked wing. These were the women whose minds didn't break. They rebelled, and for that they were punished not with cruelty, but with care. So here you are now, lying beneath a crocheted coverlet, the taste of boiled milk still in your mouth, the air pressed flat by silence. The nurse will come soon to ask if you've rested well. She'll check your wrists, she'll smile without warmth, and you'll smile back. Because to show anything else would be hysterical. The steam rises in gentle tendrils, curling against the tiled walls like shy spirits. You're not in a drawing room or a clinic anymore. You're in a therapeutic bathhouse, Victorian style, where everything echoes and nothing is quite as innocent as it sounds. Today's treatment? Hydrotherapy, also known as the water cure. To modern ears, that might conjure images of warm baths, scented oils, and spa music. But in the hands of 19th century medicine, water became a very targeted tool, specifically for hysteria. Even more specifically for, well, the area doctors most like to blame for everything. Enter the vaginal water jet. Let's take a moment. A device not unlike a glorified garden hose was directed at the patient's pelvic region. The force of the stream? Adjustable. The temperature? Cold, tepid, or hot, depending on the diagnosis. Sessions lasted anywhere from 10 minutes to an hour, during which time the patient was asked to remain calm and seated. You can imagine how well that went. Historians still argue whether hydrotherapy was meant to soothe or stimulate. The language used in medical manuals suggests both. Doctors described the stream as tonifying or revivifying, and noted that many women experienced a relieving nervous climax. In other words, yes, again, it was an orgasm machine. But this time, with plumbing. One case study tells of a woman who had endured 23 sessions of hydrotherapy and emerged less melancholic and more constitutionally composed. She also requested a bidet for her summer home shortly afterward. Coincidence? The debate continues. The Victorian obsession with water had a long pedigree. It symbolized purity, cleansing, and renewal. But when aimed with pressure and purpose, it also became a strangely clinical way to explore pleasure without ever naming it. Hydrotherapy clinics popped up across Europe, especially in France, Germany, and England. Women of means would check in for weeks, sometimes months, receiving daily sessions of these jet treatments. One particularly popular setup involved a chaise longue with a hole in the center. The patient would recline, modesty intact, with a strategically placed towel, while a nurse adjusted the nozzle below. If you're picturing a car wash for your emotions, you're not far off. A fringe tidbit from a Parisian journal: in some bathhouses, the jets were powered by natural springs. This led to the marketing term nature's pressure, which sounds like something you might say before running to the restroom. But not everyone embraced the water cure with such enthusiasm. Some doctors expressed concern that patients were becoming overly fond of their treatments. There were murmurs, muffled but present, that some women faked symptoms to prolong their stays. One physician even wrote, "The risk of dependence is real, especially in women with fragile constitutions and expressive eyes. Expressive eyes. Truly a terrifying condition." The real conflict lay between effect and intent. The treatments worked. That much is clear from the surviving records. Women reported lower anxiety, better sleep, improved mood. But the reasoning? Murky at best. Victorian medicine insisted this was nerve calming, not pleasure-inducing. And yet, so many patients emerged from their sessions with a dazed contentment, not unlike what you'd see in someone after a really good massage. Let's stick with that. In The Erotic Spirit Through History, Webb discusses how cultures have often disguised erotic healing rituals as spiritual or medicinal practice. The Victorian water cure fits neatly into that legacy, a physical, sensory experience veiled in clinical language. Let's meet someone caught in that veil. Miss Arabella Hexton, age 29, unmarried, sent by her family to a seaside clinic after excessive letter writing and refusals to wear pastel. She undergoes a twice-daily water jet session, followed by cold compresses to the forehead and readings from Psalms. By week 3, she is quieter. Her hands tremble less. She gazes out the window as if the sea itself has whispered something only she can hear. When asked if she feels better, she replies, "I believe I have been thoroughly rinsed." It's important to pause here and acknowledge the layered oddity. These women were being treated for symptoms caused by social confinement, using methods that, ironically, involved even more control. The water wasn't liberating, it was directed. The relief wasn't emotional, it was mechanical. The whole thing was like building a clock to fix a scream. And yet, it helped. Even the skeptical doctors admitted as much. One British physician wrote, "Though I remain uncertain as to the mechanism of cure, I cannot deny the visible benefit." That's Victorian for "I don't know what this thing does, but blimey, it works." Michel Foucault might say this is the purest example of how power disguises itself. Hydrotherapy made the body submit, not through force, but through sensation. And by offering the illusion of healing, it kept women contained within acceptable emotional margins. By the early 1900s, some hydrotherapy clinics even offered at-home models. Imagine a copper contraption with foot pumps and tubing, designed to be discreetly installed near the washroom. Ads appeared in women's magazines for feminine vitality, restorative waters in the privacy of your home. They never said what the machine actually did. They didn't have to. Back in the clinic, the nurse adjusts the pressure. The doctor scribbles notes about your complexion. A bird sings beyond the open window. You're not allowed books, but you are allowed this: water, temperature, release, and the comforting lie that all of this is just another Tuesday in the noble pursuit of medicine. You return now to the softer corners of the Victorian home, where things are a bit less clinical, but no less bizarre. You're in a parlor draped with heavy curtains, where the air smells faintly of bergamot and candle wax, and someone has absolutely been crying into a handkerchief embroidered with their own initials. This is not a hospital. It's a home. A proper, well-ordered home where even the scandal is monogrammed. And yet, in the midst of all the domestic elegance, tucked between tea service and piano recitals, there lies a secret so oddly common it barely counts as a secret: the in-home Hysteria massage appointment. Yes, for the wealthier classes, the treatment of hysteria didn't require travel to a clinic. Why endure the carriage ride when the doctor or the machine could come to you? You'd schedule it the way one might today book a facial: Tuesday, after fencing. Or perhaps Wednesday morning after embroidery class. A discreet note sent to Dr. Fortesque or Dr. Blanchard. A quiet knock at the door. The maid lets him in. The lady of the house finishes her tea, adjusts her bodice, and disappears upstairs. Historians still argue whether these house calls were ever acknowledged for what they really were. The official explanation remained unchanged. The doctor was there to treat nerves, release tension, or address feminine congestion. No one dared say it, but everyone knew it. The parlor would remain empty for an hour or so. Maybe a clock chimed. Maybe the family dog waited by the door. Then the lady would reappear, eyes brighter, posture relaxed. She might say she feels a touch better or mention a craving for lemonade, and life would go on. Fringe detail. Some women kept personal ledgers tracking their episodes and how long it took the doctor to produce a paroxysm. One surviving diary page from a Mrs. H. of Surrey reads, Monday, 27 minutes. Friday, 19 minutes. Sunday, unusually brisk, 13 minutes. Must remember to eat beforehand. These treatments became part of a hidden routine, one that lived in the polite margins of the day, between the milliner and the violin teacher. They weren't discussed, but they were expected. Some women even developed strong preferences. They'd refer to their doctors with oddly respectful affection. Dr. Elliot is very methodical, or Dr. Crispin has a most considerate approach. In a twisted way, these appointments became one of the few structured spaces where women experienced something close to bodily autonomy, even if they had to pretend otherwise. They requested treatment, they scheduled it, They sometimes initiated conversations about it, but always under the illusion that this was not about desire. This was about health. In Sex with Kings, Eleanor Herman describes how royal mistresses often controlled palace access through intimate appointments disguised as health consultations. The domestic hysteria treatments were, in a more bourgeois way, a similar performance. Power, intimacy, and discretion wrapped in satin gloves. Let's peek inside a fictional but familiar household, Lady Millicent Ardley. A widow with a taste for chocolate and robust novels. She receives Dr. Alderton every Wednesday at 2:30. The parlor staff know to keep the gramophone playing softly, and the housekeeper prepares a glass of sherry for afterward. Lady Millicent refers to these visits as her weekly constitutional. When asked how she manages to remain so serene, she replies with a small smile and says, "Routine, my dear. Routine." There's an argument to be made, one some scholars still debate, that for certain women, this ritual was the only form of intimacy available to them. Sex within marriage, particularly among the aristocracy, was often infrequent, impersonal, and driven by procreative duty. Pleasure was rarely the point. So to have an encounter framed as therapy, but experienced as something warmer, even if fleeting, it was meaningful. Even the machines, once unwieldy, steam-hissing monstrosities, were getting smaller. By the 1890s, personal vibrating devices had entered the market under names like the Chattanooga or the Relaxaid. Some resembled hairdryers. Others had unsettling claw-like attachments that looked more suited to poultry preparation than self-care. But they were sold as nervous relief devices and were often advertised next to lamps or lace curtains. A particularly popular model, the Pulvermacher chain, was marketed as an electrotherapeutic corset. Worn under your dress, it promised to apply soothing current to the abdomen and revitalize the female disposition. We don't know how many women actually wore them. We do know that one British postmaster intercepted so many orders for vibrating devices labeled as kitchen tools that he began collecting them in his private study. Another fringe note: some doctors made home visits in pairs. One would perform the treatment, the other would document the session. It was said to preserve professionalism. More likely, it preserved plausible deniability. And so the drawing room became something more than a space for conversation. It was a treatment center, a chapel of female routine, a silent room where everyone nodded at nothing and smiled at everything. Even now, you can imagine the rustle of skirts, the tap of the doctor's bag on the hall table. A maid dusts the mantle without making eye contact. The lady of the house straightens her hair, and somewhere a clock ticks. Not loudly, but with meaning. Because after the tea and the novels and the needlepoint, there is this, a moment of stillness, a gentle hum, a quiet paroxysm, and then the rest of the day. You open your eyes to the faint scent of beeswax polish and a subtle whirring from across the room. Today, you're about to meet the most reluctant celebrity of this whole historical sideshow, Dr. Joseph Mortimer Granville, physician, inventor, utterly horrified father of the Victorian vibrator. Let's be clear, Granville didn't mean to change the course of intimate gadgetry forever. He wasn't a lascivious inventor tinkering away by candlelight. He was a respectable, rather fussy gentleman with a bad attitude toward hysteria and an even worse attitude toward the way his invention was about to be misused. You see, Granville invented his electromechanical device, Granville's percussor, to use its proper and decidedly unsexy name for muscle pain. Neuralgia, sciatica, things that could be said at dinner without a relative fainting into the tureen. The device was handheld, battery-powered, and looked like something you'd use to polish a brass teapot. It buzzed with stern purpose, and was meant to be applied to aching backs, stiff shoulders, and inflamed joints. Granville was proud of it. In his notes, he described its function as precise, invigorating, and devoid of wasteful effort. And then, word got out. Doctors, especially those already cramping their hands from manual hysteria treatments, saw the vibrating percussor and had a light bulb moment. Why not try it? There! You can almost hear Granville shouting from the 19th century, "That's not what it's for!" Historians still argue whether the appropriation of Granville's percussor was intentional or accidental. Some claim the shift was inevitable. Once a device could produce reliable rhythmic motion, its potential applications were endless. Others believed the adaptation was quiet and gradual, creeping through the medical community like an unspoken rumor. Peter Webb, in The Erotic Spirit Through History, writes about the slippery nature of invention, how objects created for one purpose often find themselves used in radically different, sometimes embarrassing ways. Granville's device was a classic case, built for shoulders, hijacked for something else entirely, and Granville hated it. In 1883, he published a furious clarification in The Lancet, distancing himself from any therapeutic application to the uterus or its surrounding structures. He called it misguided, morally repugnant, and entirely absent from my intentions, which translated into modern speech means, "Stop using my machine like that, you perverts." But his protests went largely unheard. By that point, the medical profession had embraced the vibrator with practical enthusiasm. It was faster, less exhausting, and, most importantly, it maintained the illusion of detachment. A machine had no motives. A machine couldn't be accused of misconduct. And in that gap between intention and interpretation, the vibrator blossomed. Granville, meanwhile, went back to treating rheumatism, presumably while muttering under his breath every time a colleague brought up his handy little machine. Let's look at one of the early case reports from a London clinic. A doctor writes of a patient who had endured 43 episodes of hysteria in a single year, and who was now being treated with mechanical percussive therapy twice weekly. He notes a marked improvement. He does not mention where the machine was applied. That was the Victorian way. Leave the juicy bits to the reader's imagination, and wrap everything else in a medical thesaurus. Fringe detail of the day. Some clinics began adding velvet-lined cases and gold trim to their machines, turning them into luxury items. The Madame Restora, for example, came in a mahogany box with detachable heads and a silk cord. It was marketed to lady physicians, though many were sold to housewives under the table. And as these machines entered private homes, their uses expanded. Women claimed to use them for everything from back pain to melancholy of the female disposition. Manuals remained evasive. One page from an 1896 pamphlet shows a drawing of a woman smiling while holding the device near her abdomen. The caption? "For troubles below, a gentle glow." Meanwhile, Granville's name began to fade, not as a scandal, but as a footnote. His percussor was now simply a vibrator, the kind that doctors used, the kind that women borrowed, the kind that eventually stopped pretending to be anything else. You may be wondering, why didn't someone just say it? Why didn't the medical community, or the women themselves, acknowledge that these treatments were sexual in nature? Because to do so would have shattered the illusion. The illusion that women had no sexual needs of their own, that medicine was entirely objective, that pleasure could only exist if it was sanctioned, disguised, or properly Victorian. So here sits Granville, watching his invention slip away into the eager hands of practitioners and patients alike. He mutters, he fumes, he writes angry letters to medical journals. But the gears keep turning, the batteries keep buzzing, the treatments continue. You, dear listener, are now perched somewhere between history and comedy. The image of a stern-faced doctor operating a mechanical hummingbird with no clue, or every clue, as to what he's actually doing. The patient, eyes closed, polite smile fixed. Everyone in the room pretending they're solving a problem no one can quite define. And in the corner, Granville sighs. Because he tried to invent a shoulder massager, and accidentally sparked a quiet revolution. Tonight, we slip from the clink of teacups and buzzing percussors into the dim-lit seance room of Victorian spiritualism, where ghosts are summoned, tables levitate, and occasionally hysteria is treated through the laying on of hands. But not quite the way your Sunday school teacher meant. Yes, this is the part where things get weird. Weirder than steam-powered vibrators and uterus compasses. We're entering the mystical side of hysteria. The spiritualist salons, seance circles and divine trances where women shook, moaned, levitated, and sometimes came out cured. You may be asking, wait, were ghosts part of the hysteria cure now? In some circles, yes. And in some very literal ways, the ghost wasn't your dead uncle. It was your sexual repression. Let's rewind. Spiritualism in the Victorian era was huge. It spread like floral wallpaper through polite society, particularly among women, who found in seances and mediumship a strange kind of liberation. In drawing rooms across London, Paris, and Boston, middle and upper-class ladies were going into trances, communing with spirits, and, very often, convulsing gently while doing so. Historians still argue whether spiritualism was a genuine belief system or a masked performance, a socially acceptable space for female expression in a society that otherwise prized stillness and silence in women. What's clear, though, is that the overlap between hysteria and mediumship became impossible to ignore. In fact, some of the era's most famous mediums were women previously diagnosed with hysteria. They were pale, prone to fainting, known for sudden outbursts, and suddenly they were popular. Invited into respectable homes to channel messages from beyond, and sometimes accidentally to cure themselves in the process. How? Through trance states. Doctors began observing that women who fell into spiritual trances during seances emerged calmer, less weepy, less tense. Some believed the contact with spirits was genuinely healing. Others believed the trances provided a somatic release, the same kind of paroxysm doctors were chasing with vibrating gadgets, but achieved here through a blend of theater, suggestion, and sheer emotional release. And sometimes, through hypnotic touch. There's a delicious passage in The Erotic Spirit Through History where Webb explores the thin line between spiritual healing and erotic awakening. The female medium, trembling on a chaise longue, eyes rolled back, whispering cryptic truths, she wasn't performing pleasure. But she wasn't not either. Enter the mesmerists, early hypnotists who believed magnetic forces could realign the body's internal harmony. These men, usually men, would gently touch their patients' heads, temples, sometimes their chests, and sometimes lower. The sessions often involved slow hand movements, whispered instructions, soft ambient music. Sound familiar? One particularly famous case comes from Paris, where a young woman named Clotilde G, her full name was discreetly omitted from records, was treated for involuntary weeping and extreme agitation. After 3 sessions of magnetic trance administered by a well-dressed physician mystic, her symptoms reportedly vanished. When asked what she felt during the session, she replied, "I remembered being touched, and then I forgot everything." Fringe detail? Some seances featured a spirit cabinet, a little curtain-draped box where the medium would sit to strengthen her connection. What else happened in the cabinet? That depends on which historian you ask. There was even a term, therapeutic magnetism. It sounded respectable, like something involving lodestones and gravity. But in practice, it was hands, touch, breath, whispers. Some of these men billed themselves as healers of the inner feminine pulse. And no, that's not a euphemism I just made up. It's exactly what they called it. You can almost imagine the scene. Madame Duval's drawing room. Velvet drapes, flickering candles, a circle of women holding hands, eyes fluttering, voices rising. The medium begins to tremble. She channels the spirit of a long-dead child or beloved ancestor. Her breathing grows rapid. Her posture slumps. By the end, she's radiant, spent, restored. Doctors would write about these women afterward as transformed by trance. But they never quite addressed why the trance helped. Because doing so would mean acknowledging the obvious. That what the vibrator did mechanically, the seance sometimes did symbolically. That what the physician's gloved hand achieved in silence, the medium's convulsion mirrored in dramatic fashion. Michel Foucault would say, this is how power flows. Not through direct orders, but through rituals, through repetition, through the slow shaping of desire into something administrable. And in this case, into a candlelit circle of politely moaning women on velvet cushions. Let's revisit a case, fictional but grounded. Miss Georgina Ainsley, age 32, unmarried, known for migraines and inappropriate laughter. After several failed rest cures, she is invited to attend a seance in Kensington. She is skeptical, but attends. There she is seated next to the medium, a delicate woman in a black lace shawl. The lights are dimmed, hands are joined, the medium sighs. Georgina feels warmth, a strange chest-tightening breath. Her hands begin to twitch. A tear slides down her cheek. The next morning, she writes in her diary, "I have never felt so calm. My breath is lighter. I feel emptied and new." She never returns to the doctor. Was it the ghosts, the trance, or simply the first moment in years that Georgina had been allowed to feel without consequence? We'll never know. But as you sit now in the flickering glow of imagined candlelight, hands clasped gently with the others in our seance circle, it's worth considering how many women were saved not by medicine, but by the rituals medicine refused to understand. The curtains are drawn, the candles burned low, and the room you now enter feels literary. This chapter doesn't buzz or gurgle or hum, it crackles, with the sound of paper, with a pen scratched feverishly across a page, with a woman trying to save herself the only way she could, by writing her truth in secret yellow ink. You're about to meet Charlotte Perkins Gilman, the woman who turned the rest cure into literary revenge. She's best known today for her short story, The Yellow Wallpaper, that haunting psychological descent, written in a voice so intimate, so breathless, that it still makes readers uncomfortable. But behind that fictional narrative lay a very real person. A woman who was prescribed the rest cure and came terrifyingly close to breaking under it. Charlotte was not a typical Victorian woman. She was tall, serious, fiercely intellectual, and politically engaged. She gave public lectures. She wrote essays about gender and economics. She believed, outrageously, that women should be allowed to earn their own living, and worse, be taken seriously. So, of course, she was diagnosed with hysteria. After the birth of her daughter in 1885, Charlotte experienced what we would now call postpartum depression. But in the 1880s, there was only one prescription for a woman who felt lost, weepy, or overburdened: the rest cure. And not just any version. She was sent to one of the leading practitioners of the method, Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell, whom we've already met. He instructed her to lie still. No writing, no work, no reading, just rest, and a life confined to domestic softness. She was to surrender her mind to the quiet of her bedroom, the softness of her pillows, and the rigid rhythm of being cared for like a china doll. Historians still argue whether Mitchell was deliberately oppressive or just medically misguided. He treated hundreds of women with this method, convinced that stimulation, mental, emotional, or physical, was the true enemy of feminine health. But in Gilman's case, the treatment didn't soothe her. It nearly unmade her. She wrote later that the forced inactivity plunged her deeper into madness and left her feeling like a creature of fog and cotton. She began to hallucinate. She forgot how to speak in full sentences. Her thoughts, once sharp, witty, political, became fragile threads she struggled to follow. Eventually, she fled the cure. She left her home, left her marriage, she chose freedom over propriety, and for a time, even left her daughter in the care of relatives, because she feared becoming the very ghost Mitchell's cure had tried to make her into. And then, she wrote, in 1892, The Yellow Wallpaper was published in the New England magazine. The story is deceptively simple. A woman is confined to a room by her husband, a physician, for her nerves. He assures her it's for her own good. He forbids writing. She stares endlessly at the sickly yellow wallpaper, eventually imagining that a woman is trapped inside it. By the end, she believes she is that woman, and she crawls along the floor, liberated and unhinged. The story is short, but it is volcanic. It's an act of rebellion in 6,000 words. Fringe fact: Gilman mailed a copy of the story to Dr. Mitchell himself. She never heard back. But later, she claimed to have learned secondhand that he changed some of his treatment protocols because of it. Even now, The Yellow Wallpaper is studied not only as fiction, but as a historical document, a glimpse into the psychological cost of forced silence. Peter Webb, in his exploration of erotic and emotional expression, describes writing as one of the few sanctioned escapes for Victorian women. Gilman weaponized it. Her pen became scalpel. Ink became ether. Her story didn't just express rage, it dissected the very system that had tried to erase her. Let's imagine Gilman again, in the early hours before dawn, a small lamp burning low, her hand racing across the page. The walls around her, once so still, now vibrating with words she was never allowed to say aloud. There's a passage from her diary that reads, "I did write. I wrote with a pen made of defiance and fear. I wrote because the silence was too loud." And there were many other women like her. Women who never became famous, but who wrote secret journals under lace-covered blotters, who scribbled poems into the margins of cookbooks, who composed entire novels in their heads while lying in forced rest. Fringe detail? Several rest cure clinics reported mysterious ink stains on the fingers of patients who had no access to writing materials. In one case, a nurse discovered a series of sonnets hidden inside a mattress seam. The patient denied everything. She was later labeled recidivist hysterical. Because in that world, to write was to rebel. Michel Foucault noted that madness is often not the loss of reason, but the loss of permission. And Gilman's madness, if it can even be called that, was never the wildness inside her. It was the refusal of the world around her to accept that wildness as wisdom. So now, as you sit quietly in this imaginary room with yellow-tinged wallpaper curling at the edges, you hear the scratching of a pen somewhere nearby. A woman is writing in secret, not because she has the luxury, but because she doesn't have the option of not writing. And as the candle burns lower, you realize her story saved her, and it's still saving others. The walls are taller here, gilded, embroidered with velvet tapestries and indulgent silence. You've crossed the channel now into the smoky salons and marbled corridors of 19th century Paris, where medical science, eroticism, and spectacle all decided to throw a very strange party. Welcome to the Salpêtrière Hospital. Imagine an institution so grand, so mythologized, that it functioned as both asylum and opera house. The doctors wore tails. The patients were referred to as subjects. And every Thursday morning, in a lecture theater packed with Paris's elite, women with hysteria were hypnotized on stage for science. Yes, on stage. This was no metaphor. It was a weekly medical event hosted by the esteemed neurologist Dr. Jean-Martin Charcot, who believed hysteria was a genuine neurological condition, not some flighty moral failing. To prove his theory, he conducted public demonstrations where he hypnotized women into seizures, trance states, and full-body catalepsy while the audience took notes, and tried not to blush. Historians still argue whether Charcot was a progressive figure or a deeply problematic showman. On the one hand, he gave these women clinical legitimacy. On the other, he turned their suffering into a kind of intellectual cabaret. Many of Charcot's patients were former sex workers, washerwomen, or women institutionalized by families who found them inconvenient. Once inside Salpêtrière, their symptoms, trembling, fainting, fugue states, were studied through increasingly elaborate methods. Hypnosis became the favored tool. Under trance, patients were more malleable, more performative, and occasionally more suggestive. Take Augustine, one of Charcot's most photographed patients. A teenager with sharp cheekbones and a tendency to collapse dramatically when prompted, she became the unofficial poster girl of hysteria. Her image, arched back, eyes half-lidded, was printed in medical texts, postcards, even newspaper illustrations. And yes, you heard right. Postcards. People collected images of hysterical women like they were opera singers or ballet stars. There was a certain aesthetic to it all. Pale skin, clenched hands, torn bodices, not quite porn, not quite pathology, just enough lace to keep it respectable. Fringe fact, Charcot's lecture hall seated nearly 400 people, and it was often full. Artists, writers, aristocrats all came to watch the Grand Mal hysteria unfold live. Marcel Proust's father once attended. So did Freud. So did curious socialites looking for an intellectual thrill. And the women? Well, they trembled, moaned, arched, collapsed, and then were wheeled off stage for someone else to clean up. It's worth noting that many of these women showed no symptoms outside the stage. Or rather, their symptoms varied greatly depending on who was watching. Some scholars believe that, consciously or not, the patients began to perform hysteria, mirroring what the doctors expected. It became its own strange language, its own choreography. In The History of Sexuality, Foucault describes how institutions create their own truths, not by discovering reality, but by observing and repeating patterns until they feel real. Salpêtrière was a theater of repetition. The doctors said this is what hysteria looks like, and the women, for lack of other options, obliged. And beneath the surface, something stranger. Because under hypnosis, some of the women revealed what they wanted. Not just symptom relief, but intimacy, touch, attention. One woman told a doctor mid-trance that she felt complete only when seen. Another declared, the body is not sick, it is misunderstood. Peter Webb would call this the confessional edge of erotic medicine, where desire, repression, and performance all swirl together like absinthe in a cloudy glass. It's intoxicating, a little dangerous, and deeply confusing for everyone involved. Let's imagine one of these women, Clémence D., 24, previously employed in a cafe, institutionalized by her uncle for scandalous independence. She undergoes daily hypnosis sessions with a doctor who believes her spasms are the result of childhood trauma. But Clemence, clever, theatrical, and tired, begins to exaggerate her symptoms. She knows what gets attention. She begins to hum during her trances. She begins to smile. One day she is asked, "Do you remember the moment the hysteria began?" She replies, "It began the first time I was not allowed to say no." And yet, her diagnosis is written as classical hysteria type 3, no sexual trauma reported. The system listens only to what fits its narrative. Fringe detail. The Salpêtrière had a photography lab on site. They took thousands of images of patients under hypnosis during seizures or posed in recovery. It was one of the earliest examples of medicine using visual media to construct knowledge. It also blurred the line between documentation and voyeurism to a troubling degree. The women were rarely named, just numbered. They became case number 42. Subject B. Faces without stories, bodies without context. And when Freud visited Salpêtrière as a young man, he was mesmerized. He watched Charcot's performances, took notes. Later, he would begin developing his own theories about the unconscious, repression, and of course, libido. But even he, in private letters, admitted feeling unsettled by the staged convulsions. He called them real, and yet theatrical. The irony? As clinical hypnosis gave way to psychoanalysis, the women of Salpêtrière faded from history. Their images remained, but their voices did not. So here you are now, seated in the back of Charcot's grand hall. The velvet curtain rises. A patient enters, her nightgown perfectly rumpled, her expression vacant. A hush falls. The doctor raises his hand, the pendulum swings. And somewhere, deep within the performance, a real woman aches to be seen. You step gently out of the Parisian lecture hall, the scent of chalk dust and medical cologne still lingering. The crowd disperses, murmuring about the latest trance spectacle, as if they'd just seen a magician pull a rabbit from a corset. But let's take a breath. Because now we're going to ask a question so simple it feels almost rude in its honesty. If hysteria was so universal among women, why didn't men get it? And if they did, why didn't they get massaged for it? Cue the awkward silence. The answer, of course, has nothing to do with biology and everything to do with power, gender, and the ever-humming machinery of polite denial. Hysteria, as we've seen, was built upon the belief that a woman's body, and by extension her mind, was inherently flawed. Too soft, too emotional, too inconvenient. Men, they had melancholy, nervous exhaustion, overwork syndrome, all those cigar-scented, man-approved maladies that required only rest, scotch, or a trip to the Alps. Historians still argue whether this medical double standard was consciously imposed or merely inherited. But either way, it was deeply entrenched. Two people could present with the same symptoms: fatigue, insomnia, chest pressure, and only the woman would be labeled hysterical. Only she would be offered massage. Only she would be told, gently but firmly, to lie down and stop thinking. Let's meet a fictional but familiar fellow, Mr. Horace Pennington Bryce, a London banker who hasn't slept in 3 weeks and claims to hear the wallpaper whispering in Greek. His doctor recommends fresh air, golf, and reducing tobacco. That's it. No vibrating table, no steam-powered paroxysms, just a brisk walk and a firmer pillow. Meanwhile, his wife, Beatrice, who's perfectly healthy except for a tendency to read poetry at odd hours, is diagnosed with uterine unrest and referred for weekly therapeutic sessions involving a leather-padded couch and gloved assistants. See the difference? It's not that men didn't suffer. They did. Many were riddled with anxiety, depression, digestive disorders, and vague existential dread. But their suffering was framed as external, caused by war, commerce, stress, something noble, something public. Women's suffering, by contrast, was internal, secret, embarrassing, something floral to be handled behind lace curtains. The result? Only 1/2 of the population got offered orgasm as a medical solution. And it wasn't the half writing the prescriptions. Now here's the twist. Some men did exhibit symptoms that looked very much like hysteria: emotional volatility, unexplained fatigue, digestive issues, and even fainting. And in rare cases, a few doctors actually called it male hysteria. But these were exceptional, often dismissed, and never, ever treated the same way. One notable case was a Parisian tailor who experienced nervous spasms and lightheadedness. His physician prescribed cold baths and long sermons. In the footnotes, the doctor added, "The patient briefly asked if his wife's treatment might suit him. I discouraged this line of thinking." Quell surprise. In The Erotic Spirit Through History, Webb notes that sexuality has always been gendered in how it's allowed to manifest. Female sexual distress was medicalized into dysfunction, something to be treated, soothed, handled. Male sexual issues? Often ignored, or else pathologized as weakness. Fringe detail? One Victorian doctor theorized that infrequent marital congress might cause male nervous tension, but suggested boxing or military drills as a solution, never massage. Because apparently, nothing cures emotional repression like punching your friends in the rain. Michel Foucault would argue that this reflects how medicine polices identity. The body isn't just treated, it's trained. Men were trained to externalize, to suppress. Women, to internalize. Let's imagine a Victorian husband and wife, Reginald and Edith. Reginald comes home tense, silent, overworked. Edith suggests he lie down, have a brandy, talk about his day. He refuses, says he needs solitude. She, however, has been weeping quietly for hours, her embroidery tangled, her breathing short. He calls the doctor. The doctor comes not for him, but for her. He examines her hands, her pulse, declares a delicate nervous disorder. She is scheduled for pelvic massage. Reginald reads the paper in the next room, still trembling slightly. Because masculinity did not permit treatment that even resembled vulnerability. Certainly not one that required undressing and, gasp, receiving pleasure under the pretense of science. But here's the deeper tragedy. Some men probably needed it. They needed to be touched, to be listened to be soothed, not with barked instructions, but with presence. But Victorian medicine offered them no such space. Emotion in men was to be converted into ulcers, migraines, stiff upper lips. And so, as absurd as it sounds, women were privileged in one peculiar way. They were allowed to receive physical care. Yes, it was laced with condescension. Yes, it was coded as illness. But it was offered, something most men couldn't even ask for. And when you see it that way, the whole system begins to shimmer with irony. The doctors thought they were curing women, but sometimes they were helping them, just by accident. And the men? They sat in silence, frowned, drank, and wondered why their backs hurt. The couch is long. The air smells like cigar ash and confidence. And the man across from you has a beard that seems to be thinking its own thoughts. You've arrived at the office of Dr. Sigmund Freud. The room is cluttered, dream journals, Greek statues, animal figurines that might be paperweights or possibly just symbolic. You don't know, but Freud does. Or at least, he thinks he does. Because now, hysteria is no longer just a wandering womb or a mystery to be massaged. Now, it's a symptom of the unconscious. And it has everything to do with sex. Freud began his career studying under Charcot, watching the staged trances of hysterical women in Paris. He was fascinated, even if he later found the spectacle unsettling. But what stuck with him wasn't the convulsions. It was the cause. Historians still argue about the exact moment Freud decided that suppressed sexuality was at the root of hysteria. Some say it was during his early experiments with hypnosis. Others suggest it was simply the only conclusion available to a man who saw sex lurking behind every curtain. Either way, by the 1890s, he was writing essays with titles like The Etiology of Hysteria and coining phrases like conversion neurosis. He abandoned physical treatment. No more water jets, no more percussors, and replaced it with the talking cure. The idea was simple. Patients would lie on a couch, speak freely, and reveal buried memories. And somewhere in that word-soaked landscape, they'd find the root of their pain. Often it involved childhood desire, Oedipal confusion, or repressed sexual longing. Peter Webb calls Freud's method an erotic archaeology, digging through layers of propriety to find the forbidden impulse at the core. Let's meet one of his real patients, Anna O. Anna, real name Bertha Pappenheim, was treated by Freud's colleague Joseph Breuer for symptoms including paralysis, hallucinations, and muteness. Through a method later dubbed chimney sweeping, she began to recover, bit by bit, simply by telling stories. Her words became medicine. Her memories, exercised. Freud took this and ran with it. By 1905, he was suggesting that all hysteria came from repressed desire. Even physical symptoms, trembling, fainting, tics, were, in his view, the body's way of expressing sexual frustration it couldn't admit aloud. Fringe detail? Freud once described a woman who had difficulty drinking water because of a fear that it would trigger inappropriate thoughts. He concluded she had oral repression stemming from unresolved infantile desire. The woman never came back. Still, the theory stuck. It gave structure to the mess of hysteria. Instead of a uterus floating around the body like a misguided jellyfish, now there were narratives, subconscious fears, symbolic dreams. Hysteria became not a disease, but a riddle. The vibrator? Gone. The water jet? Forgotten. Now healing came through listening, through the slow unwrapping of repression. Of course, Freud being Freud, he framed all of this through a lens of male-centric desire. His famous theories, the Oedipus complex, penis envy, castration anxiety, placed female hysteria firmly in the realm of what women lacked, not what they wanted. Desire was absence. Longing was pathology. Michel Foucault would later critique this framework, arguing that Freud replaced one system of control, the clinic, with another, the couch. He didn't free women's minds. He rebranded their suffering with symbolic chains. But for many, psychoanalysis felt like progress. At least now, women were talking. At least now, there was some acknowledgement that hysteria wasn't purely physical. It was emotional, intellectual, and deeply personal. Let's imagine a patient, Mrs. Clara B., age 38, widowed, sharp-witted, prone to stomach upset and inappropriate laughter. She visits Freud. She lies on the couch. She begins to describe her childhood, her marriage, her late-night fears. Freud listens, he nods, he scribbles. Eventually he asks, "And how did you feel about your father?" Clara stares at the ceiling. A bird chirps outside, and something shifts. No hands have touched her, no machines have hummed. But in that question, something is named. Something she's never said aloud. And for the first time in weeks, she sleeps through the night. Did Freud get everything right? Not even close. Some of his theories now read like literary fiction, poetic but wildly speculative. He pathologized too much, misunderstood even more, and often ignored the social and political roots of women's suffering. But he changed the language. Hysteria was no longer a mysterious female curse. It became something you could talk about, investigate, trace through dreams, memories, and missed opportunities. And for some women, that shift was enormous. The vibrator had tried to cure the body. Freud tried to cure the story. And in that messy transition from noise to narrative, hysteria lost its grip. So here you are, reclining on a dusty leather couch, the sound of a fountain burbling just beyond the window. The room is quiet, but not cold. The doctor's pen taps gently on the edge of his notebook. You could say anything, but for now, you breathe and let your story unfold. You close the heavy office door behind you, stepping back out into the gaslit streets of Vienna. Or was it London? Or Paris? The address doesn't matter. The real journey tonight is not geographic, but anatomical. And now we're about to peek inside the cabinets of the curious, the desks of the deviant, and the private libraries of very serious men with very serious mustaches. Because tonight we descend into the curious world of early medical texts. Texts that were supposed to educate, and ended up titillating. This is the era of the pornographic pathology. Let's set the scene. It's the late 1800s. Doctors, scholars, and naturalists are documenting everything. Plants, bones, dreams, digestion, phrenology, astrology, and yes, sex. But they can't say sex. That would be unprofessional. So they say reproductive habits, degenerative urges, deviant expressions of nervous excitement, and then they illustrate them in great detail with copperplate etchings. Now, before you imagine something modern or glossy, let's be clear. These weren't Penthouse. They were heavy leather-bound tomes filled with medical diagrams that somehow, accidentally of course, lingered just a little too lovingly on certain parts of the human body. One infamous example is Krafft Ebing's Psychopathia Sexualis, published in 1886. A book so dense, so Latin-laced, and so filled with case studies that you almost miss what's happening. Almost. Krafft Ebing, an Austrian psychiatrist, set out to catalog all known sexual perversions, which he very generously defined to include nearly everything. Masturbation, deviant. Homosexuality, illness. Female sexual autonomy, unthinkable. And yet he documented it all, at length, in a tone of clinical horror, but with enough lurid detail that readers began treating the book less like a warning, and more like a bedtime story they read with the curtains drawn. Fringe fact, the book was banned in parts of Europe, which of course made it wildly popular. One Paris bookseller reportedly hid copies in the back room, only offered to gentlemen of quiet tastes and secure reputations. It wasn't just craft-eating, of course. Medical textbooks in this period were often riddled with illustrations that seemed oddly invested. Anatomical drawings of women mid-paroxysm, diagrams of pelvic massage technique rendered with the kind of shading usually reserved for romantic portraiture. Historians still debate whether this crossover between medicine and softcore voyeurism was deliberate or simply the byproduct of a culture that couldn't name its desires openly. Either way, the result was clear. Pathology became performance. Peter Webb notes that these texts often served two audiences: the official reader, a student, a physician, and the secret one, a curious gentleman with a locked study drawer. The books promised knowledge, but delivered something far more ambiguous. They taught, and they titillated. Let's imagine one of these readers. Mr. Ernest Thimbleby, bachelor 53, retired civil servant, owns a barometer and a sense of quiet despair. He purchases medical observations on female hysteria and nervous function under the pretense of general interest. He reads by candlelight. Adjusts his spectacles. The text is dry. Then suddenly an engraving. A woman, eyes closed, torso arched, captioned "Subject in full nervous episode." He reads that page 3 times and closes the book slowly. No bookmarks needed. He'll remember. These volumes weren't just informative. They were cultural artifacts. They revealed how deeply tangled sex and science had become, especially when the former had to wear the clothes of the latter. Even the language used was performative. Words like lubricity, excitability, feminine tumult, wombic agitation. Phrases so ornate you could stitch them onto a pillow and no one would know they were medical euphemisms for orgasm. Fringe tidbit? Some of these books were hand-annotated by doctors. Margins filled with tiny looping script. Unusual sensitivity, note for further study, responds poorly to vibration, consider alternate approach. You can practically see the sweat on their upper lips. Of course, not all readers were men. Some women, especially those in progressive circles, read these books too, often with a mix of horror, humor, and secret recognition. They saw themselves in the case studies, their symptoms, their longings, their silence. But rarely, if ever, were they addressed directly. Because in the world of pornographic pathology, the female patient was always an object, not a participant. She was studied, described, measured, never heard. Until she started writing back. Some of the earliest feminist medical critiques came in response to these texts. Women wrote pamphlets, essays, quiet rebuttals. They questioned the conclusions, mocked the tone, demanded to be seen not as symptoms, but as people. Michel Foucault argued that power hides in classification. When you name something, you own it. You control how others perceive it. These books didn't just describe female sexuality, they defined its boundaries. They turned desire into diagnosis. And in doing so, they left behind a strange legacy. One of shadows and side-eyes. Of respectable men turning pages just a little too slowly. Of women who read themselves into margins they were never meant to occupy. And now here you are, in a library that smells of ink and lavender. A heavy book open on your lap. The illustrations are careful, the descriptions cautious. But beneath every line a whisper. Someone knew exactly what they were doing. The book snaps shut with a satisfying thud. The dust swirls upward. You wipe your hands on your skirts, or trousers, tonight we're flexible, and you take a deep breath. Because now it's time for a question that still echoes across lecture halls, libraries, and late-night debates. Was it all just medicalized misogyny? Let's not whisper. Let's ask plainly. Were Victorian doctors sincerely trying to help women? Or were they, knowingly or not, using medicine to reinforce a worldview that kept women quiet, compliant, and on their backs, literally and metaphorically? Historians still argue, endlessly, passionately, sometimes with pie charts. On one side, you have the defenders of context. They say, look, these doctors weren't villains. They were men of their time, working with the best tools, best theories, and best mustaches they had. Hysteria was a mystery. So they did what they thought was right, even if it looks absurd to us now. On the other side, you have critics who argue, no, these men knew exactly what they were doing. Maybe not consciously, not with mustache-twirling malice. But their treatments were rooted in a social order that saw women as defective men, creatures of weakness, emotion, and dangerous unpredictability. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in the cluttered, softly lit middle. Let's break it down. Fact: most hysteria patients were women. Fact: the symptoms were often ambiguous, unprovable, and highly subjective. Fact: the treatments nearly always involved controlling, suppressing, or physically intervening in women's private selves. In fact, the entire apparatus, from rest cures to water jets, was built on the idea that the female body needed male authority to correct its dysfunctions. Fringe detail? Some physicians openly admitted their discomfort. One London doctor wrote in 1879, "I sometimes feel we are not so much curing as conducting a ritual." A rare flash of self-awareness, quickly followed by a 14-page discussion of uterine position and bile theory. So, was it misogyny? Not in the modern angry sense. No one stood over these women shouting, "Silence, wench!" except perhaps in the very dramatic seances. It was something quieter, more dangerous. It was a system that labeled independence as illness. A woman who read too much, overstimulated. A woman who didn't want children, cold womb syndrome. A woman who questioned her treatment, uncooperative. Possibly delusional. Even today, these patterns echo. Consider the modern language of emotional instability, attention-seeking, or too sensitive. Medical bias hasn't vanished. It's just updated its terminology. Peter Webb calls this the erotic echo chamber, a place where women's feelings are mirrored back to them as faults, diagnoses, or justifications for control. If you feel too much, it's because you're sick. If you feel nothing, it's because you're broken. Let's meet someone who lived that contradiction. Lady Constance Elbridge, fictional but familiar. She was educated, multilingual, and known for speaking up at dinner. Her husband, concerned by her intensity, called the doctor. She was diagnosed with incipient hysteria marked by argumentative streaks. Her treatment? Isolation. Tonic baths. Quiet music. The result? Constance learned not to speak during meals. She survived, but she also disappeared. And that's the core of the critique. These treatments didn't just aim to heal. They aimed to erase. Not through violence, but through velvet. Not through punishment, but through professionalism. Foucault would argue this was the genius of Victorian medicine. It hid domination inside care. The doctor didn't punish the woman. He rescued her from herself. And in doing so, gained access not just to her body, but to her narrative. Which is why feminist historians have reclaimed these stories with such fervor. They see in these women the beginnings of resistance. Charlotte Perkins Gilman didn't just recover, she wrote. Anna O didn't just tell her story, she challenged her therapists with it. Even the patients at Salpêtrière, stripped of agency, put on display, still found ways to perform hysteria on their terms. To shape the script. Fringe fact: some women deliberately faked symptoms they knew would get them admitted, just so they could escape violent husbands or exhausting domestic duties. A form of resistance through performance, a way to say, you may own my diagnosis, but not my reasons. So was it misogyny? Maybe not in the way we like to imagine villains, but yes, in the deeper, structural sense. It was a system designed to maintain a certain kind of order. And it did so beautifully, quietly, elegantly, with gloves on. And yet, it couldn't hold forever. Because eventually, women started writing back, speaking up, studying medicine themselves, publishing essays that said, actually, doctor, I think you're wrong, and also my uterus is exactly where I left it. So tonight, as you sit with these contradictions, the kindness of some doctors, the cruelty of some cures, the blurred line between comfort and control, you don't have to choose sides. Just listen to the hum beneath the history, to the whisper beneath the diagnosis, to the sound of a woman refusing to be a footnote. You hear it before you see it. A soft hum like a bee trapped in a velvet purse, a quiet tremble in the air. Then the gleam of polished brass and delicate mahogany. It's time to trace the journey of a device that once sat on doctors' desks and slowly vanished into bedside drawers. Tonight we follow the vibrator's curious fall from grace. At first it was nothing scandalous. The vibrator entered Victorian medicine as a tool, practical, impersonal, and astonishingly effective at treating hysteria. As we've seen, it saved doctors time, spared their wrists, and standardized the otherwise unpredictable business of inducing paroxysms. But something changed. Not all at once. Not with scandal or legislation, but with a slow, creeping awareness that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't strictly medical anymore. Let's rewind a bit. By the late 1890s, Vibrators had become a quiet fixture in many medical practices and in many upper-middle-class homes. They were advertised in respectable catalogs with language so euphemistic it bordered on poetry. Phrases like nerve tonic and restorative instrument nestled comfortably between ads for foot warmers and corset-lacing hooks. Fringe fact: Sears sold vibrators in their catalog until the 1920s. Page 558, Dr. Swift's electro-massage appliance for muscular fatigue and female nervousness. Available with attachments. No explanation of where those attachments went. But even with all the linguistic dancing, people began to catch on, especially when the devices started appearing in other kinds of publications. Silent films, French cartoons, risque jokes in drawing room plays. The vibrator, for all its medical branding, began to develop a reputation, and not the kind you could talk about over tea. Historians still argue whether it was public suspicion or private knowledge that brought about the vibrator's fall from medical respectability. What's clear is that by the early 20th century, something had shifted. Doctors stopped prescribing them, ads became more cryptic or disappeared altogether, and suddenly the vibrator was no longer science, it was shame. The final push came, ironically, from the invention of actual pornography. Early films in the 1910s and 20s began to feature vibrators as props, not in anatomical lectures, but in scenes of playful scandal. These images spread, and with them, the vibrator lost its respectable cloak. Once something appears in erotica, it becomes difficult to keep it in the medicine cabinet. Peter Webb notes that this is the strange life cycle of many erotic tools. Born in ritual, passed through science, buried under shame, and then resurrected as pleasure. The vibrator's disappearance from medical journals wasn't a dramatic censorship. It was a vanishing, quiet, almost embarrassed. Doctors stopped recommending it. Catalogs pulled the listings. Women, if they still wanted one, had to look elsewhere, through coded advertisements, backroom vendors, or personal connections. Let's imagine Mrs. Edith Marlowe, age 45, widowed, living in Bath. She used to receive her treatment at Dr. Tilbury's clinic, but he's recently retired. The new doctor, a younger man with cleaner fingernails, refuses to speak of vibratory therapy, says it's outdated, suggests sleep tonics instead. But Edith knows what she needs. She writes a discreet letter to a cousin in London. A week later, a brown parcel arrives. No label, no instructions. Just a soft buzz when she twists the dial. She hides it in a drawer beneath her gloves. She tells no one, because now it's not medicine. It's something else. Something unspeakable. Even as the device itself remained unchanged, its meaning was rewritten. No longer a tool of healing. Now a sign of moral looseness. To possess one was to hint at self-pleasure, autonomy, desire, and Victorian society wasn't ready for that. Fringe detail? In 1922, an American journal ran an anonymous editorial warning about the increasing appearance of massage tools in women's boudoirs. It warned of indulgent habits that could threaten feminine virtue. No names, no proof. But the message was clear. This thing we once prescribed, forget we ever did. It's a strange kind of historical gaslighting. Medicine said, here, use this. Society said, how dare you? And women, caught between the two, said nothing. Michel Foucault would call this the disappearance of discourse. The vibrator didn't become taboo because of what it was, but because people stopped talking about it. It faded into silence, and then into myth, until decades later, when it came roaring back. But that's a tale for another time. Tonight you sit with this knowledge, a device that once buzzed quietly under the hands of physicians, surrounded by charts and clocks, became something to hide. It wasn't the machine that changed. It was the permission, the language, the gaze. And as the world turned its head, the hum continued, beneath drawers, beneath covers, beneath the thick quilt of history. The air smells faintly of dust and damp velvet now, the way old hotel parlors do in the off-season. You're standing in a room full of echoes, a space where no one talks about what everyone knows. The vibrator is no longer mentioned in medical lectures, no longer featured in polite catalogs, no longer demonstrated under clinical lighting with diagrams and charts. And yet, it's still there. So now we ask, why did it take so long for this treatment to truly disappear? Let's begin with an awkward truth. For decades, even into the early 20th century, the vibrator continued to linger in the margins of both medicine and consumer culture. Not because it was still officially endorsed, but because it filled a gap, a need, a silence. Many women knew it worked. Whether they called it nerve therapy or vitality support or simply my little helper, they kept using it. Quietly, consistently. Doctors, too, remained divided. Some refused to discuss it. Others quietly prescribed similar methods under new names. Vibrational stimulation, abdominal nerve excitation, percussive tonic therapy. Nothing illegal, nothing explicit, just a continuation. Historians still argue whether this prolonged half-life was driven by denial or demand. Probably both. Let's break down the forces at play. First, the social factor. The early 20th century was not, despite its fancy automobiles and jazz, a hotbed of open sexual conversation. Women were still expected to be modest, passive, and, above all, disinterested in pleasure. Admitting that a device gave them relief, let alone satisfaction, would have been scandalous. So even as vibrator ads disappeared from catalogs, the need remained. It just went underground. Fringe fact, by the 1930s, department store clerks had a whole range of coded phrases. A woman might ask for the electrotonic massager, or the silent motor model. The clerk would nod. No questions. The device came wrapped in brown paper. Second, the economic factor. Small companies and home appliance brands had discovered a profitable niche. They couldn't call it a sex toy, but they could sell it as a personal revitalizer. And as long as they didn't say where it revitalized you, they were safe. The demand stayed steady. The ads got vaguer, but the boxes kept moving. Third, the medical factor. While official medical bodies moved away from hysteria as a diagnosis, some private practitioners still clung to their old training. Especially in rural areas, the massage method persisted into the 1940s and beyond, rebranded as pelvic health support or uterine balance therapy. One real-life example, a 1947 case study from a small-town American clinic described using gentle electrical pulses to treat female nervous symptoms with satisfactory outcomes. The equipment? Unlabeled. The notes? Delicately phrased. Peter Webb writes that many technologies endure long after they fall out of fashion, especially when they serve a need society isn't ready to acknowledge. The vibrator was no different. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't political. It just worked. And then there were the women. Women who passed their devices down, quietly, mother to daughter, friend to friend. Let's picture two of them, Mrs. Ivy Hartridge, age 62, and her niece, Beatrice. One afternoon in 1951, over tea, Ivy leans in and says, "You'll be traveling soon. Take this with you. It helps when the nerves get fluttery." Beatrice opens the package later, reads the instructions, smiles. No one ever talks about it again. Fringe tidbit? In 1953, a patent was filed for a household back massager with a curiously flexible head and a travel pouch. It was approved, sold in several hardware stores, and never once marketed to women. But guess who bought them? This was the era of strategic forgetting. The vibrator didn't disappear because people objected. It disappeared because they stopped acknowledging what it had been. Medicine backed away, culture turned its head, and women were left to figure it out on their own. Michel Foucault would say this is how power retreats. Not by being overthrown, but by stepping aside, leaving the tools in place, but stripping them of context. The vibrator remained. But the official story no longer mentioned it. Only recently, within the past few decades, has the device begun its strange reemergence. Now it lives in boutiques and wellness shops. It appears on Instagram and gift registries. It's been reclaimed, rebranded, re-understood. But for almost half a century, it lived in a cultural shadow, and yet, somehow, it never left. So here you are, surrounded by a century of silence and static, a legacy of soft motors, polite nods, and euphemisms stacked higher than the Empire State Building. You hold the history in your hand, it hums. Not just with voltage, but with memory, with resistance, with all the things no one wanted to say, but everyone knew. The room is quiet now, but not silent. Silence in this space is a companion, a soft echo of every confidential murmuring that's come before. You're lying on a padded chaise, the low hum of night settling around you like a silk shawl, and you sense it, the last coil of this strange, intimate journey. Tonight, in this final chapter, you'll face the legacy of hysteria itself. The word that carried every unspeakable sorrow, every unexplained emotion, every burst of creativity, and every whisper of autonomy. The diagnosis that told women their lives were symptoms, the cure that told them their bodies were malfunctions. But most of all, the space it created for women to be heard, even when nothing else would listen. Let's revisit. It all began with corsets, dignified shame, and gaslit consultations. And we've traced the tools of treatment: hand, water, and machine. We've watched methods shift from mechanical hums to Freudian whispers, each promising relief while masking control. We've seen the dancing line between cure and coercion, healing and hush. And now we ask, what remains when the hysteric's diagnosis is withdrawn, when the words are finally allowed to fall away? Historians still argue whether hysteria was just a medical mistake or a societal mirror. One side says it was an earnest misreading of mysterious suffering. The other says it was a covert way to pathologize independence. The truth? It's tangled in both, onyx and pearl, mixed in the same locket. Here's what we know. A woman arrives restless, sleepless, her heart thrumming with something she cannot name. She's told it's hysteria. She's massaged, washed, hypnotized, coughed up in front of lectures, endured buzz and judgment. And sometimes she just needed to be given space to speak, to feel, to laugh, to write, to breathe. And in that space, shaky, small, awkward, something unspoken found a crack to slip through. A diary entry hidden in a mattress seam. A short story in Gothic yellow wallpaper. A private electric hum behind closed boards. A paroxysm we later called orgasm, but then called release. A seance's convulsion we whispered about, and a so-called cure we reclaimed as self-care. Those moments of self-knowing, that's the real legacy. You might recall Charlotte Perkins Gilman's secret flicker of rebellion, her pen slashing at medical orders. Or the Salpêtrière women, trembling with faint light in their eyes, performing what they were supposed to feel, and startling the audience by doing it on their own terms. Or the Irish maid treated for tremors who found herself quieter, safer, less watched. Those women disappeared in official records, but they endured in subtext, in margins, in garden whispers, in shared glances, in the electricity of a borrowed machine passed from hand to hand, mother to daughter, friend to friend. Let's consider the fringe moment of reclamation. The vibrator, once a shameful secret, later appeared in wellness ads as intimacy devices and self-care tools. It went from taboo to trendy, illustrating how something once silenced can be spoken again. Reclaimed, reframed, repurposed. That arc echoes the whole story, from diagnosis to denial, from control to conversation. Remember the wandering womb theory we laughed about? And the doctor's gloves that hummed under Victorian gaslight? And Freud's couch draped in pillows ready for your hidden stories? They all tell versions of one truth. The body speaks, even when doctors say it doesn't. For you right now, lying in modern safety, you don't need a prescription. You don't need a machine. You simply need permission. Permission to trust yourself, to feel, to name, to art, to pleasure. Oddly enough, that was the real radical shift. Not the vibrator, not the couch, not even the talking cure, but the moment a woman whispered, "I feel, I know, I exist." So as you drift towards sleep, let these final thoughts settle like soft pollen. 1. Hysteria taught the world to diagnose, but women taught the world to listen. The cure's hum was a betrayal of trust, and yet it flickered space for something truly powerful. 3. When words weren't allowed, women found ways to speak. In ink, in diaries, in private machines, in shared rituals, in runaway narratives. 4. And maybe that's your medicine tonight, the quiet act of acknowledgement, that your feelings deserve space, your body has wisdom, and your story is worth telling. Now, take one long, slow breath. Let the imaginary gaslight fade behind your closed eyes. Feel your chest rise and fall in the dark. The electricity is no longer in machines or lectures. It's inside you. Still humming, still knowing. There is no more diagnosis tonight, no hype promises of cure, just rest and the faint, steady comfort of being heard. Sleep well, dear listener. Sweet dreams.